This lesson expands what you know about data types. You will also be learning different variations of uh, input and output, and you'll be learning some character testing methods and conversion methods. So as far as data types go, we've been working with integer, which are whole numbers, and we've been working with bool, which is true or false, and we've also been working with string, which is anything in double quotes. We're going to expand on that and learn more about numbers that have decimal places, and those can be float or double. And then we're also going to be learning about character, and character data is enclosed in single quotes. So string, which is typically more than one character, has double quotes around it. Character data has single quotes. One of the reasons that you specify data types is so that the computer reserves the correct amount of space in memory for the data. That is one of the reasons that we use the data types. This will make processing time faster, and you avoid errors that way. So these data types are kind of important. And, when in doubt, I would go with the larger size. So for float and double, the difference is basically the precision, which is the number of decimal places that you can have. For float, it only stores 6 to 7. And when you reach that limit, it either chops off the rest of the number or it rounds it up. So not the best data type for any kind of monetary variable. Double actually has much more precision, up to 15 decimal digits. So that is actually the preferred way of creating values that have decimals. Character data is just one character. So it's like one letter or one number or one symbol. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you read in and process these types of variables. So for double, you just use the keyword double, give it a variable name, and set it equal to the value. If you're going to do float, it's very similar, but at the end of the float number, you have to put an F. And I know we haven't talked about long yet, but integer and long are both whole numbers. Integer is kind of the default. So if you use integer, you just set your variable equal to the number, to the whole number. And that works as long as your numbers are in this range. But if you're going to have like a super humongous whole number, then you should use long. And you can see that long has a much larger range. And for a long variable, you have to put an L at the end. So for float, you have to put the F at the end. For long, you have to put the L at the end. If you use integer and you use double, you don't have to worry about putting those letters at the end. So my advice to you would be to use integer or double, unless you have a very good reason for using long and float. So I do have a little programming example here. Obviously, I've got two different variables. One I've declared as double and one as float. You can see the F at the end, but we have a little problem because this is way too long. So the output does show you that it indeed truncates quite a large portion of the end of that number, which, if this was a monetary transaction, that would be a problem. This little example shows you how to read the data in from the keyboard. And because console.readLine reads string data, it assumes everything that it pulls in is a string. You have to convert it to either double or float. Okay, and you can use double.parse or float.parse to do that. And again, the data that I entered for float was way too long, so you can see what happens to that data. As I mentioned earlier, a character is just one letter, one digit, or one symbol. And the way that you let the system know that it's a character is that you put it in single quotes. Anytime you put something in double quotes, it is a string. And strings are stored differently than characters. Strings take up a little bit more space. Okay, characters do not. So when we are working with characters, you don't necessarily know what the character is. That is where these little character testing methods come into play. We've got is digit, is letter, is number, is symbol. They're called is or is testing methods. And the format for them is very similar. You start with capital C character, char, dot, and then the name of the method. So is digit is letter, and then in parentheses is the value you want tested. So that can be a variable, or you can actually take the character, in single quotes and pass it that way too. This first little example, I've got 4 different characters that I have created. One is a letter, a number. I've got a special character, and I've got a control character, a tab mark. And so I'm using is letter, is upper, and is lower. So each one of these is kind of the same thing, but it's just testing each one of these different characters. So this first section of code is testing the first character, second section of code is testing the second one, and so on. So what we're doing is we're testing the character, and it's either going to return true or false. If it returns false, it does nothing. If it returns true, then we write a little message and we test to see if it's upper or lowercase. So if it's uppercase, we print out a message. If it's not uppercase, it has to be lowercase, and we print out a different message. And we're doing that for each one of these. So really the only one that should print out is the first one, because the second, third, and fourth are not letters. And here is the output. It is only the first one that printed something out. So now I took that same example and I changed it up a little bit. So now I am checking the first to see if it's a digit or if it's a number. Okay, and I'm doing the same thing with the second, the third, and the fourth. And so the number 1 did test true for both digit and number, which I would expect it to. This next example is testing for a symbol or a control character. So you've already seen how the test for the letters and the numbers or digits work. So now we're going to test for the symbol and the control character. So we're testing for a symbol. If it's not a symbol, we're testing for a control character. So this is kind of a little nested if else. Okay, and we're doing that for the first one, the second one, the third one, and the fourth one. And so you can see that the caret character, it did detect that as a symbol. And then the next one, the message is kind of weird. It's the value is a control character. It can't print out a tab. So that's why it's got that kind of a weird message. There's no way for it to print out the tab, but that was what it was encountering when it displayed that message. Console.read. We're going to talk a little bit about how that differs from readline, and then we're going to talk about some character conversion methods that you will use. So console.read reads one value from your input stream or input queue, whereas console.readline reads everything, including the enter mark, which is called a new line. Whereas console.read only reads one, and if they've only entered one character, that new line character is still in the queue, it's still in your input stream. So if you're going to process one character, which means that, you've typed one character and pressed enter, there are actually two values in the input stream. There's the value you entered and there's the enter mark. Okay, and so if you have a program that is you have some kind of a loop and you're going to have the user enter single characters at the input queue, you have to get rid of the new line character. If you don't get rid of that new line character, it's going to think that is what they entered instead of a letter. So the correct way to code this would be, you've got console.read, and surprisingly, that reads in an integer. And then you've got your enter mark, and you need to use another console.read to get rid of it. So you can either do the variable equals console.read and then use another console.read, or you can use a console.read line. Now I have found that console.read line works probably a little better, because if there is anything in the queue besides the new line, it just wipes out everything. Okay, but here, enter your character to get the decimal number. We read that in, and then we remove everything from the queue. Okay, so that's what that little example is showing you. So when you're using console.read, you can actually read multiple things from your input stream. If you're in a loop, you can process one character at a time. And when it hits the end, it gets a -1. And so there is a way then for you to determine if you have reached the end of your input stream, because if what it read in was a -1, you're at the end. So knowing what it displays at the end allows you to use a loop. Now, normally I would use a while loop, but you guys haven't learned that yet. So we're going to do the looping with a for loop, which is what you're familiar with. So we're using console.read, and we're reading in an integer, okay, which I know is kind of a weird thing. Basically, it's the decimal equivalent of the character that you have typed. So we're reading that in, and then you'll notice that we omitted the counter, and we've omitted the increment variable. So all we're doing is we're just having our conditional test check that the letter doesn't equal -1. Because if it's a -1, we're done. Okay, and then in between our curly braces, that's where the code goes that we want to process. So this would allow you to read one character at a time. Now, because our console.read is retrieving an integer, we need a way to see the character that we entered instead of the numeric equivalent, which is going to be meaningless to most of us. So convert.toChar converts the integer into a character. So we need to use this when we use console.read in order to see the actual character that was entered. And so you can use it as part of your console.read statement, or you can use it anytime you want to see the value. So here in this example, I've used console.read. I've put the value into an input integer. And then you can see in my console.write line, that's where I've got convert.toChar because I don't want to see the decimal version. I want to see the actual letter or number or symbol that I entered. So that's one way to do it. So we're storing the integer version, but when we want to print, we are converting it. The other way to do it is to convert it to character when you are reading it from the console. So we've got convert.toChar, and then the parameter that we are passing that method is console.read. So whatever we read in from the console gets passed on and converted. And now you'll notice because we are converting it to character as part of reading from the console that we're using the character data type. So this little example shows what the character looks like in decimal format and in character format, just so you can kind of see how this looks by default and why you have to convert it. So I've got this set up in a little loop, so it's going to run 5 times. And so I just do a console.write line to give myself a blank line. And then I've got enter your character to get a decimal number. And we read that in. Now you'll notice I declared input as an integer. So we're reading that in. Because I only read in one character, I have to remove the new line. Okay, so I do a console.read line, and then I want a blank line written. So I do a console.write line. And then I want to display the letter or special character that I typed. So my first little display, I am using convert to character. So it is going to look exactly like what I typed at the keyboard. The second write line, I am not converting it to character. So this is the decimal version of whatever I typed in. So here is an example. You can see it ran 5 times. So I entered the letter K. And so when I use convert to character, it looks like a K. But if I did not use convert to character, the decimal version is 107. And for a capital M, okay, if I use convert to character, yep, it looks like a capital M. But if I just print it out without converting it to character, the decimal version is 77. Okay, and you can see with symbols like the $sign, it works the same way, right? If I convert to character, I get my nice little $sign. Otherwise, I get that decimal version. And the same goes with numbers. So if I do the number 4 and I convert to character, I get that number 4 that I entered. But if I don't do any conversion, it's going to display as 52. Okay, so you can see what happens to these values. I also, at the end here, thought, okay, well, I'm only supposed to enter one character. What happens if I enter more than one? Well, as you can see, it only reads in one. And that's the one that it converts to character. And if you don't convert it, the value is displayed. The read line statement that I have here erases anything else that's in the input stream. Okay, so the 8, 0, and the enter mark got erased. I've got another programming example For this one, I actually convert to character when I read the letter in. So again, we're looping 5 times, and I'm printing out a little blank line. And the reason I do that is just so my output isn't all scrunched together. And then I've got a little message here, enter a letter or phrase, and I'm going to display the first letter. Okay, and then I'm reading in the letter, and you can see I'm doing a convert to character, so I can actually store it as a character. And then I've got a read line to remove everything else. I'm writing out a blank line, and then I'm displaying that first character to them. Okay, so you can see I entered a phrase, row, row, row your boat, and here's the first character. And I've got a phrase, and here's the first character, okay, and so on. And this little program, we're actually going to loop through a string and retrieve one character at a time. And so how we're doing this is we're going to use a for loop because we haven't learned while loops yet. And we're basically going to read from that input stream character by character until we encounter the -1. So we're asking them to enter a word or phrase, and then we're saying we'll display each character. They entered in uppercase letters. So here we're reading it in, and you'll notice I have integer here, although I could have converted it to character if I wanted. And then we've got our little for loop. And here we're going to stay in here while it's not -1. And so here I've got console.write. I am converting to upper here. And then inside that, I am passing the letter that has been converted to character. So inside here, I'm converting it to character. I'm passing it to upper, and I'm writing it out. And then I'm reading in the next letter. Now, because I want to test for a -1 here, I don't really want to convert to character when I read it in, right? Because I want to be able to test for the -1. So that's part of the reason we're waiting to convert to character until we're writing it out. But this actually lets you loop through and it'll read one character at a time. So here's the phrase I entered. And then here is what it printed out. And so even though I've got a digit in here, it still worked fine. So it basically went letter by letter. And so it read in actually read in a capital H, right? And it's stored in decimal form here. And then it got converted into a letter. So it got converted into a capital H. And we sent it to upper to convert it to a capital H, which it would have just ignored because it was already a capital. So that capital H got written out. And then the next time through, it would have retrieved the lowercase a. And here it converts it from the digit format into the letter A. And then here, that little letter A gets passed, converted into uppercase, and it gets written out. Okay, it does the same thing with the V and the E. It even reads in the space. Okay, although it's not going to do much with convert to character or character to upper. It's still going to pass them, but it's not going to process them. And then it does this until it gets to the end. After it's read in the number 9, okay, so we read the number 9 in here. We send that to character. So remember, the decimal form of 9 is not actually a 9, it's other digits. So it actually, at this point, will convert it into a 9. Okay, and then it sends it to the upper, which isn't going to do anything because it's a 9. And then it just writes out a 9. And then when it gets to here, that's the end. So what it's going to do is it's going to retrieve -1. So at that point, letter, it does equal -1. So it's going to drop out of the loop. Okay, so that's pretty much the processing that's going on in here. Your lab assignments are going to require similar programs. So please let me know if you have any questions about how these work.